AM 630. WMAL.
7:37 on WMAL. Brian Wilson, Brian Neiman. We've been talking a lot about the high court ruling yesterday on Obamacare. The Attorney General of Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli, is on the line, a man who is one of those who has challenged the Obamacare law. And if I read you right, Mr. Attorney General, you have the sense that while you don't agree with the ultimate outcome that the law was constitutional, you do see some upside to the Supreme Court ruling yesterday. Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we lost on knocking out the bill, and so now the only path remaining is the election. But because the Chief Justice did not rely on the Commerce Clause, in fact, agreed with us on the Commerce Clause limitation on the federal government, and they added a new limitation on federal spending power, which is going to be beneficial to our state government here in Virginia. It was the one part of the bill that was blocked. But because they did uphold it on the taxing power, they, one, read the taxing power very broadly to do that. But two, they also made it repeal attainable, because, you know, Mitt Romney's been talking about his willingness to repeal it all along, but for a president to repeal it, you got to get a bill to your desk. And that's always taken 60 senators under any reasonable scenario we can think of. Because it's a tax bill, it only takes 51 votes in the Senate. It can't be filibustered. And so George Allen's, for instance, his race against Tim Kaine, who tried to have Virginia's biggest tax increase ever, and now was the biggest cheerleader for what I think was the biggest tax increase at the federal level. Don't hold me to that as gospel, but with a $1.76 trillion price tag, and the Supreme Court saying, no, this is a tax. I think that's what we've got there at the federal level, and the reason people don't like those tax increases, and the reason all those Democrats were trying to call it something else, is because their voters don't like tax increases. They know what they do to the economy, and we're living through it. Well, we're trying to.
That's a great legal analysis, and I would guess from a political standpoint then that the argument that should come from the GOP is, if you want to repeal Obamacare, you need to make sure that Romney becomes the president and as many Republicans get elected to the Senate as possible.
That's absolutely right, and it's easy for people to understand. It's not like some shtick. You want to get rid of this? This is the path to do it, and we have 4 months and a week to do it.
How rare of a ruling was this, though, from John Roberts, when you actually say, hey, the plaintiffs are right in this case, it is unconstitutional, but I'm going to change the way the law is written to make it stand? I mean, does that happen a lot?
Yeah, I mean, he really... No, it does not. And there was a reason nobody expected this ruling. And I'll be candid. I think he got it wrong, and the reason so little attention, including by all the prior judges and all the prior courts, was paid to this tax argument is because it's not a good argument. It's not a good basis for upholding the law. But he got 5 votes for it. I'll also point out that in the oral argument, Justice Ginsburg, Monday and Tuesday, described what she believed to be a tax. You know, this is what a tax is, this is what it isn't. She said the same thing both days. And she had to abandon that relatively defined position to uphold this law as well. And she didn't have any qualms doing that. She did it with great enthusiasm, would have clearly much preferred the Commerce Clause analysis, but Chief Justice Roberts wasn't going to let 5 votes get there on that point. And what's particularly painful is the dissenting 4 Justices Alito, Thomas, Scalia, and Kennedy made it clear if we'd had a 5th vote, we'd have thrown the whole thing out. So we got awfully close yesterday, awfully close without winning on this.
Well, there is some speculation that John Roberts changed his mind at the last minute, and that's because if you look at the writings from Justice Kennedy, he often said "we," I guess, as a sign that he was in the majority. Do you think that's accurate? Is that a possibility that John Roberts changed his mind at the last minute?
You know, that's one of those things we can guess at. Yeah. Unlike the executive branch, the Supreme Court actually keeps secrets.
Yeah, right.
And you know, it'll take 30 years till he writes his book for us maybe to know that one.
All right, one more thing on this. I'm just trying to figure it out, and maybe there is no explanation to it at all. But the original argument was, hey, you can't even take this up because of the Anti-Injunction Act, which means it has to be ripe. There has to be an actual tax, and somebody has to be wronged before you can actually rule on it. And John Roberts ruled that, well, it's not a tax, so we can't rule on it. And then he turns around and says, well, it is a tax. Does that make any sense?
I mean, that's part of why I say he's just flat wrong, and that nobody expected this type of ruling. I will say that if you're going to do it, this is about as least damaging constitutionally as he could have done it, because of limiting the commerce power, limiting the spending power, alongside expanding the tax power. And you know, I don't have a logical explanation for that.
Right.
I mean, I just don't think there's any reasonable explanation that's consistent across his whole opinion, explaining all three parts of it.
All right.
I just don't think there is such an explanation.
On the Medicaid front, so what does that mean for the states? It means that you don't have to do these things. Now, you're running for governor as well. Does that mean that you would try and rein in the amount of people that can be on Medicaid? Because I know that
absolutely. I mean, this is a $200 million a year hole when it gets going in Virginia's budget, and in the fastest growing part of our budget, by which I mean the part that's eating up the rest of the budget. And you know, now, because the Supreme Court said, and just to be clear for your listeners, when they reined in the federal spending power, what I mean by that is they said that the part of the bill that the federal government was threatening to cut off Virginia's Medicaid funding, all of it, if we didn't sign on to the massive expansion of Medicaid, was unconstitutional, and they couldn't do that. And realize the federal government uses that spending club all the time. So that's a substantial restriction on the federal government, especially in historical terms, since it's the only one and the first one on the spending power since the New Deal. So that's a big deal. And what it means as a practical matter for Virginia is now we're going to have discussions, and we've been consulting, of course, with the governor. I talked to the head of the Finance Committee in the Senate yesterday. They've got some decisions to make as to whether or not they join this expansion of Medicaid, because now they really have a lot more flexibility to say no. And I would expect in Virginia we would say no, because I don't know where we're going to come up with the money to fund it. Even our portion, even though the feds start out sort of trying to bribe you into it, they start by paying a lot of it.
Right.
But we've all seen federal promises, including right in this bill, that they just fail to keep.
All right.
As they go forward. So I think Virginia would be unwise to rely on those expectations, and frankly, I don't know where we'd come up with the $200 million a year going forward anyway.
All right.
We're already strained in our budget, and unlike the federal government, who, you know, their notion of a government compromise is you get what you want and I get what I want, and we'll just borrow the money to do it.
We
don't do that in Virginia.
All right, we're out of time. We appreciate you coming on the show this morning. Thank you very much.
Attorney General from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli.